Hi, I'm Linda Colbert, owner of Mark Twain Cave. I thought you might like a brief synopsis on the cave and how it got to be in our family. That's a question we get asked frequently. Our earliest documentation is that Jack Sims was out hunting one cold, snowy day, 1819-1820, when he spotted what he believed to be panther tracks. It was too late in the day to follow where they might lead. He came back with his brothers, William and Roderick, and a friend, J.H. Buchanan. They had their dogs and guns ready. The sport of panther hunting was huge, but nothing like discovering Mark Twain Cave. The boys were certain that the tracks from yesterday were untouched, and the panther was headed into the opening in the hillside. The dogs went in first. As their bark became fainter and fainter, the boys decided to go in with their torches. From the flicker of their torches, they were amazed to see such high ceilings and so many branching passages. Also, to their amazement, the inside was so much warmer than the outside on that cold, snowy day. Undocumented reasoning is the possibility of Indians in the cave much earlier, as that population was in the area. There were 6 tribes that settled in this area because of Bear Creek. Tools have been found, but no drawings or etchings on the cave walls. With the Sims brothers discovering the cave on that cold, snowy day, the first name was Sims Cave. Other pseudonyms soon to follow were Panther's Cave, then Saltpeter's Cave in 1830-1848 because of the abundance of bat guano. Saltpeter was a major ingredient in gunpowder. McDowell's Cave in 1848, then changed to Mark Twain Cave in 1880 after the publication of The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. In 1848, Dr. Joseph Nash McDowell purchased the cave from perhaps a land grant. He was a brilliant surgeon who needed the temperate, quiet solitude of such a place for experimentation of dead bodies. In addition to his experiment of trying to petrify dead bodies, such occupations as resurrectionists and grave robbers aided into the new discovery of medicine during that time. Young Sam Clemens was 13 now and a frequent visitor inside the cave. Upon finding Dr. McDowell's experiment inside, many years later prompted the graveyard scene in his greatest book, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. McDowell owned the cave for about 20 years until his death. McDowell's Cave became McDougall's Cave in the famous book. The slate that you were to write your name on became the post office in the story. The drop-off made a good place to encounter Injun Joe. And the treasure room, of course, is where Tom and Huck found $12,000 worth of gold upon hearing about its location from Injun Joe and his old partner. At that time, 2 Hannibal businessmen who owned the Hannibal brick plant near the cave bought the cave property. R.H. Stillwell and Zachariah Fielder probably bought it on speculation, because soon they began to develop the property for visitors coming to the cave. They built a dance pavilion, horse racing track, baseball diamond, picnic areas, and an ice house for their new soda stand, and a ticket office about the size of an outhouse. It became a very popular place. They, along with John East, a Cave Hollow resident and guide, blasted out the entrance in 1890 that we use today. Then in 1900, the property was purchased by John S. Mayland, who wanted to further the development by adding transportation from town to the cave and its attractions. He initiated a plan to extend the Hannibal streetcar line by bringing the electric car tracks out beyond the city of Hannibal. By the time that development materialized, it was surpassed by decent roads and the Model T. That property was up for sale again in 1923, and that's where our family comes in. This cave property was adjacent to Cameron's Dairy, where Sawyer's Creek is today. Great-grandfather John Cameron came to Hannibal in 1865, then bought the property next to Mark Twain Cave in 1873. He and his wife Mary had one son, Evan Thomas Cameron. E.T., as he was called, even as a small child, had been an occasional cave guide because of the proximity of his father's land to the cave. Sometimes they would just sit on a bench at the cave door and just wait. They would carry a leather pouch to put their money in for each tour. Also, Evan and his father ran dairy cattle over the land here in Cave Hollow. Today, the beautiful red barn at Sawyer's Creek was the original dairy barn, and the small stone building next to it was the ice house. Granddad, E.T., lived at the dairy all his life. He would put a lantern on a jut-out on foggy nights to aid the boats going up and down the river. Also, during the winter, he would chop as much ice off the river as he could and stored it under sawdust in the ice house to sell or to keep his milk cool. From his own father's porch, there was always a sign for guide service. Dairy farming and caving were their primary jobs. As an adult, E.T. became a county judge, so he was always then called Judge Cameron. but in our family, he was called Granddad. In 1923, the cave was for sale again, and it was only reasonable that Judge Cameron would buy the 265 acres, which he did. Granddad Cameron had 5 children, 1 son, Uncle Arch, and 4 daughters, Aunt Sophie, Aunt Helen, Aunt Amy, and my mother-in-law, Margaret. Margaret was born in the block house over at Sawyer's Creek in 1899. That block house was a Sears and Roebuck mail-order house. Of those 5 siblings, only 3 children were born. Aunt Sophie had a son, Robert Bogart. Margaret had 2 sons, Robert E. and James Cameron Colbert, my husband. By 1923, Archie was 25 years old, back from the war, and went back to work with his father in the dairy business and now as cave owners. They decided that the outbuildings needed sprucing up from the previous ownership. Also, a major decision was that a guide needed to be there full-time so that no one should have to hunt for a guide to take them through Mark Twain Cave. So Granddad and Uncle Arch had another job added to their list as cave guide. In 1925, 2 years after purchasing the cave, while running cattle, Uncle Arch made an awesome discovery. On the opposite hill across from Mark Twain Cave, he saw steam rising from a depression, with warm air rising up from a fracture in the limestone, meeting the cold February air. He felt that he may be on the genesis of discovering a new cave. He kept digging until he could climb down onto a ledge. As he crouched forward, the area opened up, and suddenly Uncle Arch saw a virgin cave. Absolutely no one had seen that ever before. Very soon, a party of 9 men began to explore a vast labyrinth cave that was much more complex than Mark Twain. My mother-in-law was the first female to tour the pristine new discovery. She was 26 years old. Many stories over the years have been told about the early years. Still today, someone would come to me and mention how they would play in Mark Twain Cave. From the 1930s to the late 1960s, Granddad and Uncle Arch would let kids from town play in the cave, but could never interfere with paying customers. At first, it was Granddad, Uncle Arch, and a few other men who lived down in Cave Hollow who were the tour guides. Granddad passed away in 1944, and Uncle Arch, who was working here, took the reins. Uncle Arch and Aunt Tilly had no children, so every child in Hannibal was their child. He, too, would let them play and be a Tom Sawyer or a Huckleberry Finn as long as they did not interfere with the tourists. By 1950, my husband, his brother, and cousin were old enough to help out at the cave. Robert Bogart already lived in Hannibal, and his cousins, Robert, 17, and Jim, 12, who lived in Lee Summit, took the Hannibal-St. Joe Railroad to Hannibal to work during the summers. My husband, Jim, would tell that Uncle Arch would let him, at the age of 14, drive the pickup to the dairy for ice cream and to get soda and potato chips from small producers here in Hannibal. These 3 grandsons of Judge E.T. Cameron grew to love and know everything about Mark Twain Cave. After Uncle Arch passed away in 1974, his grandson Bob Bogart and wife Joan managed the cave for the remaining elderly aunts. Under his watch, vast improvements and additions were made to the visitor center, and now it included a beautiful campground. By the early 1990s, other buildings were built to include a rock shop, small restaurant, and a much larger building that was to be a mini-mall. By the end of the 1990s, Bob had passed away, and now it was Jim's turn to manage the cave. I have always said that it seems like when you retire from your first job, now it's time to start another career at Mark Twain Cave. That's just what happened to Bob Bogart. He was winding down a career as an engineer at the cement plant. Jim had just retired from practicing medicine for 35 years. Robert Colbert still was president of his oil field data firm in California. Now in this millennial, Jim has passed away, and thus it leaves Robert, my brother-in-law, and me. We continue to make great improvements to the property. It's very beautiful down here in Cave Hollow, and the last and most notable addition is a winery. It was put in the building that was to be a mini-mall. Cave Hollow West Winery proudly only serves Missouri wines made from only Missouri grapes. We aged cheese in the cave, and that was first distributed along the East Coast, and now it's working its way through the Midwest. What is next? Mark Twain Cave is the oldest show cave in Missouri. It will always carry on the same historic tradition for generations to come. So, in a trickle-down effect, that's how you own a cave.